Imagine this: American soybeans, once the crown jewel of U.S. agricultural exports, now sitting in silos across the Midwest with nowhere to go. Barges leaving the Mississippi River half empty, while farmers in Iowa and Illinois scroll through price charts that just keep dipping lower. And halfway across the Pacific, in Tokyo boardrooms, Japanese trading giants like Marubeni and Mitsubishi are quietly celebrating. Why? Because Japan has just secured a series of lucrative, long-term soy contracts with Brazil and South America, locking in stable prices, premium non-GMO quality, and guaranteed delivery schedules. Contracts that, just a few years ago, would have gone almost automatically to American farmers. This is not just about soybeans. It's about power, leverage, and the collapse of an export model the US once dominated. In the early 2000s, America controlled more than half of global soybean trade. Today, that share has been slashed nearly in half, falling toward 28%, with Brazil seizing the upper hand. Japan, which imports over 90% of its soybeans, has learned a critical lesson. You don't bet your food security on America's trade wars and political tantrums. You sign your deals elsewhere. Meanwhile, US exports are in freefall. USDA data shows America's soybean sales are off to the weakest start in 23 years. In 2025 alone, shipments to China, the biggest customer, have collapsed by more than 50%. Prices are tumbling, inspections are sluggish, and analysts now warn exports could fall another 20% if no deal with Beijing materializes. And as these numbers crater, Trump, who built his political brand on being a tough negotiator, is watching helplessly as Japan and Brazil cut deals that leave US farmers in the dust. So tonight, we're going to break down exactly how Japan won the soy contracts America desperately needed, why US exports are collapsing faster than anyone predicted, and what this means for the political firestorm surrounding Donald Trump. Stay tuned, because this is not just about soybeans. It's about how America's farmers got caught in a trade war crossfire and how Japan quietly walked away with the prize. To understand how we got here, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. For decades, the US was the undisputed heavyweight in global soybean trade. From the Mississippi River down to the Gulf of Mexico, shipments of American soybeans fed the world. China, Japan, Europe, everyone bought from the United States because the supply was reliable, the logistics efficient, and the product competitively priced. American farmers became the backbone of global food security. But the landscape has shifted dramatically in just the past decade. Brazil, once a secondary player, has exploded into the dominant force. With vast farmland, low production costs, and massive infrastructure investments in ports like Santos and Paranagua, Brazil has overtaken the US in sheer export volume. The tipping point came when Chinese demand surged in the 2010s. Beijing bet big on Brazil, and Brazil delivered. Today, Brazil supplies more than half of China's soybeans, while the US is left fighting over what's left. Now, add politics into the mix. Under Trump, US farmers found themselves in the crosshairs of a trade war with China. Tariffs slapped on American soybeans triggered retaliation, and Beijing immediately shifted its contracts toward Brazil. At first, many farmers trusted Trump's promises that bailouts and new deals would keep them afloat. But fast forward to 2025, and the reality is brutal. US agricultural exports to China in the first half of the year are down a staggering 53%, and soybeans alone have plunged 51%. That is not a minor dip, that is a collapse. Meanwhile, in Japan, policymakers have been paying attention. Japan is one of the world's largest importers of soybeans, but they are uniquely vulnerable because they rely so heavily on foreign suppliers. Only 3 to 7% of their food-use soybeans are grown domestically. For staples like tofu, miso, and natto, Japanese consumers demand high-quality, non-GMO beans with clear traceability. In other words, Japan can't afford disruption. So what did they do? They diversified away from America. USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service in Tokyo recently reported that Japan is reshaping its soybean supply chain. Imports of soybean meal are set to fall to 1.63 million tons this year as Japanese processors ramp up their own crushing capacity. That means they're buying more raw soybeans directly, locking in contracts with suppliers who can guarantee steady flows. And increasingly, those suppliers are in Brazil. Japanese trading giants, the so-called Sogo Shosha, like Marubeni, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo, have moved aggressively to secure long-term agreements with Brazilian exporters. These deals aren't just about price, they're about quality, delivery security, and resilience against political shocks. Brazil offers non-GMO varieties that cater perfectly to Japanese demand. And with South America's crop booming, Japan can dictate terms in ways it never could, with the US contrast that with America's position today. USDA has already slashed its forecast for US soybean exports for the 2023-2024 cycle, putting them at a 4-year low, down about 12% from the prior year. Analysts at AgriSource warn exports could sink another 20% this season if no breakthrough with China comes. Futures prices have already slipped toward multi-year lows, reflecting the market's pessimism. For Midwest farmers, this is a nightmare. Shrinking sales, falling prices, and no clear policy roadmap to turn things around. This is the backdrop to Japan's win. While Washington is consumed by trade disputes and Trump lashes out at foreign leaders, Tokyo quietly played the long game, diversifying contracts, hedging supply, and ensuring that its food security won't be at the mercy of American politics. In doing so, Japan not only safeguarded its domestic supply chain, but also outmaneuvered the US at its own game, long-term commodity contracting. And that's why the story matters. It's not just that America lost a few sales, it's that a system where US dominance was once assumed is now breaking apart. Brazil has stepped up, Japan has adapted, and the United States is left clinging to old strategies that no longer work. Here's where the plot thickens. While US farmers struggle with shrinking demand, Japan has been quietly rewriting the rules of soybean procurement, and they've done it with precision that would make any strategist proud. First, Japan recognized a vulnerability. Relying too heavily on American soybeans meant relying on American politics. When Trump launched his trade wars, it wasn't just China that felt the ripple effects. Every major importer, Japan included, saw how quickly Washington could weaponize agriculture. Food security in Japan is not just a policy concern, it's existential. Their domestic production of soybeans is tiny, nowhere near enough to sustain consumption. That means every container ship, every contract, every ton of beans is tied to national stability. So Tokyo turned to Brazil, and Brazil was more than ready to step in. Brazilian farmers have ramped up output year after year, producing record crops that undercut US prices. But it wasn't just about cost. Japan's food industry has unique needs. Non-GMO beans for tofu and miso, reliable quality for traditional foods, and shipping schedules that align with just-in-time production. Brazil had exactly what Japan wanted, and Japanese trading companies didn't hesitate. Marubeni, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo began locking in multi-year contracts with Brazilian suppliers. These agreements secure non-GMO beans at premium prices, but they also guarantee stability, which is priceless to Japan's food manufacturers. While American farmers were busy waiting for Washington to hash out tariff deals, Japan was sitting across the table from Brazilian exporters, pen in hand. By the time US producers realized what was happening, the ink was already dry. This is not just theory, it's showing up in the data. USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service in Tokyo reported that Japan's imports of soybean meal are falling as domestic processors shift toward importing whole beans. Why? Because if you import whole beans and crush them yourself, you control quality, you control traceability, and you protect yourself against sudden disruptions in foreign supply chains. In other words, Japan is cutting out the middleman and taking control. Another crucial factor is logistics. Brazilian ports like Santos and Paranagua have invested heavily in infrastructure, while rail and road networks have improved efficiency in moving soybeans from interior farms to shipping terminals. Japan has capitalized on these upgrades, ensuring contracts not just for volume, but for consistent delivery schedules. Ships leave South America loaded with beans that Japanese companies know will arrive on time, without political drama. Compare that to the US, where river levels on the Mississippi have at times crippled barge traffic, and tariffs have made every negotiation a gamble. And let's not forget consumer pressure. Japanese shoppers demand non-GMO soybeans for food use, and Brazil's ability to supply these varieties gives it a competitive edge. American farmers, many of whom plant genetically modified crops, have found themselves edged out of this premium market. Japan's decision to prioritize contracts with Brazil wasn't just about hedging risk, it was about aligning with consumer expectations. The result? Japan won the soy contracts the US should have secured. They diversified supply away from a politically unstable partner. They guaranteed non-GMO beans that meet cultural and consumer standards, and they locked in pricing that shields them from market volatility. In doing so, Japan turned a potential weakness, dependence on imports, into a strategic advantage. Meanwhile, US exporters are left scrambling. The same contracts that once flowed through Chicago grain desks are now being routed through Sao Paulo. The message is clear. Japan no longer sees the US as the automatic supplier of choice, and that shift carries consequences far beyond soybeans. It signals a broader rebalancing of agricultural trade power, and America is no longer holding the pen. While Japan was busy locking in secure contracts, America's soybean exports were unraveling at breakneck speed. USDA data already paints a grim picture. US soybean exports for the 2023-24 cycle dropped to a 4-year low, down 12% from the previous year. Inspections at US ports have stalled week after week, and analysts warn that if no deal with China materializes, exports could collapse by another 20%. That's not a slow leak. That's a gaping hole in America's farm economy. For farmers across the Midwest, the consequences are immediate and brutal. Prices on the Chicago Board of Trade have slipped toward multi-year lows, with futures trading near $9 a bushel in worst-case projections. At that price, many family farms simply cannot break even. Equipment loans, seed purchases, and fertilizer costs all add up, and without strong export sales, the math no longer works. What was once a stable livelihood now feels like a high-stakes gamble where the deck is stacked against them. The frustration is boiling over. Farmers remember the promises. Trump said trade wars were easy to win, that tariffs would force other nations to the table, that American agriculture would come out stronger. Instead, China slashed its purchases, Japan shifted to Brazil, and US farmers are left staring at silos packed with unsold beans. Rural communities that form the backbone of Trump's political base are now watching their financial security evaporate. The narrative of America First has translated in practice into America Left Behind. This is the collapse we're talking about, not just a dip in numbers, but a seismic shock that threatens to gut entire farming regions. And politically, that fallout could be devastating. And here's where economics collides head-on with politics. As the numbers spiral downward, Trump's response has been predictable: rage, finger-pointing, and a desperate attempt to reframe collapse as someone else's fault. In recent speeches, he's doubled down on blaming China, accusing Japan of betrayal, and insisting that only he can renegotiate America's position. But the reality is undeniable. While he lashes out, the contracts are already signed by Brazil and Japan. That leaves farmers furious and disillusioned. These are communities that once rallied behind Trump's tough talk, but now they're asking, where's the payoff? Instead of booming exports, they see empty promises and silos full of unsold soybeans. Politically, it's a time bomb. Trump staked his brand on being the deal maker who could win for American farmers. Yet in the face of Japan's strategic moves and Brazil's rising dominance, he looks less like a negotiator and more like a spectator. In the end, this isn't just about soybeans, it's about credibility. Japan secured its food supply by diversifying contracts. Brazil cemented its dominance as the world's soybean superpower, and US farmers were left stranded by political gambits that backfired. The collapse of exports is more than a market hiccup. It's a warning that America's word is no longer enough to guarantee global deals. For Trump, the fallout is personal. His easy-to-win trade wars are now costing him support in the very heartland that built his movement. And for farmers, the message is clear. Loyalty doesn't pay the bills.